Hey everyone, welcome back to Writers Chat into 2022. We are so glad you're with us today, whether you're here or whether you're watching the replay. My name is Johnny Alexander. I'm joined today by my co-hosts, Melissa Stroh and Brandy Bro. I always just love saying their names because they rhyme. And I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, who's going to introduce our very special guest for today. Melissa.
Hey everyone. Well, it's an honor again to have Britt back with us. I'm just going to read you his bio because it's awesome. He's just such a great writer. In the second grade, a young and mischievous MB Mooney got in trouble since he was finished with his test while the other students continued to work. His superhero teacher, Mrs. Green, said to him, "Why don't you write me a story?" And he thought it was the best idea he ever heard, and he's been writing stories ever since. A former missionary to Korea and a public school teacher, MB Mooney markets for a missional coffee company, serves as a church planter, and is a published author of fiction and nonfiction. He and his amazing wife, Becca, live in Suwanee, Georgia with their three kids, and a silly dog. In everything, he believes a great story changes the world. And today he's going to talk to us about the expressions of hope in speculative fiction. And I'm very excited about it. Thank you, Britt, for joining us.
You're welcome. Yeah, you said you were going to maybe read the real title. You're not going to read the real title?
Yes. Can I?
Oh, it's up to you. I just thought it was funny.
We were joking because when I send out the notice to guests, tell them that we're totally willing to work with the titles of the show, but it can't be too long because it won't fit on the graphic. And Britt sent me this one first: the most awesome talk and discussion on how speculative fiction is the way to share the hope of the gospel of the kingdom of the Lord Jesus Christ in these divisive and hate-filled days of despair, by the venerable and amazing Reverend author MB Mooney.
It would have been this tiny on the image to put all that in, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, I know I appreciate being here, and I appreciate being able to talk about story. I do. The more I go on, the more God has taught me that great stories do change the world, and so things like this, where we get to sit together and be together, even on Zoom, and connect over how to write great stories, And Melissa asked me to talk about speculative fiction, right? Wasn't that the topic? Talk about speculative fiction, and and I want to focus a little today on the why of speculative fiction. It's really the why of storytelling in general, but I'm going to kind of transition that into speculative fiction in a more specific way. If you don't know what speculative, I'm having trouble saying that today. Maybe I've had too much coffee. Speculative fiction, if you don't know what it is, that's basically science fiction and fantasy. So when you write science fiction and fantasy, where there are kind of otherworldly elements to some degree, some sort of supernatural or futuristic elements, and that's really more of a Christian genre name, speculative fiction. That's what we call it. In other words, you're speculating as if this might have happened or could have happened, right? So we're going to start with the why. We're going to talk about the why today, and I love these questions because why is a very complex question. It's simple, but it's complex. And those are the questions that God wants to answer in our lives, not just the what. He wants to answer the why. And sometimes he has to tell us the what first, and then later on we understand the why. But God is about understanding, and he is about the whys. So I'm going to read a quote first. This is from G.K. Chesterton. If you've never read Orthodoxy, I highly recommend it. And Chesterton says this. He says, "Fairy tales, then, are not responsible for producing in children fear or any of the shapes of fear. Fairy tales do not give the child the idea of the evil or the ugly. That is in the child already, because it is in the world already. Fairy tales do not give the child his first idea of bogey or boogie, the boogeyman. What fairy tales give the child is his first clear idea of the possible defeat of the boogeyman. The baby has known the dragon intimately ever since he had an imagination. What the fairy tale provides for him is that a Saint George to kill the dragon. So I'll say that last line again. What the fairy tale provides for him is a Saint George to kill the dragon. Now, a summary of that, if you look for that quote, a lot of times it'll be this: fairy tales do not tell children the dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed. And so speculative fiction, which a long time ago was considered fairy tales, right? But when we look at story, hopefully we all know why we tell stories, right? Jesus told stories, right? And he made up stories. These were not real stories, right? When he told about a farmer, or he told about this guy, or he told about somebody else, or the widow, or whoever he was telling a story about, he made those up. They were fictional stories, and yet he was teaching eternal truths within the stories, right? And story is powerful for that reason. Stories are complex. And what I mean by that, the same with the question of why. Stories are complex, not complicated, complex. Complexity is deep, right? Complicated is horizontal, right? It's you're trying to fit everything together. And a story can communicate truth very simply and easily to anybody. I was doing an interview with Jesse Florea with Focus on the Family. I was doing an interview with him on my podcast back in December or November. And he said that children by the age of 2, when they hear a story, will put themselves in the place of the character. They will imagine themselves in the place of the character. Like, we have been given an amazing ability with stories to reveal, to engage people and pull them in, and to reveal truth, right? And that's what Jesus did with stories. And that's what God is doing. God is telling a story. If you don't know, that it starts with in the beginning, right? And then, right, he's telling a story. He's telling a redemptive story. And here's the other thing about stories that is awesome. Stories make us dig for meaning. Stories don't tell us, right? We all know as writers, we should show, not tell, right? We all know that that's the rule. Show, don't tell. And because it's kind of lazy, what we want to dig. It's like Jesus didn't tell parables to explain things better. He actually told parables to see who would dig further than the surface and get to the real meaning. That's why he told parables. Because remember, his disciples kept arguing with him, like, will you stop telling parables? Will you just tell us what you mean? Like, because it was confusing. Like, but see, here's the thing. We love to dig. We love to discover. We're curious people. God has made that in us. And so stories activate that longing within us to discover. And when people discover things, if anybody in here was a teacher, you talked about me being a teacher. A good teacher doesn't just give a student information. A great teacher puts the child or the student in a situation where they discover the information for themselves, and then they take ownership of it. When they discover it, it's now theirs. When they discover the information or the truth or whatever it is, it's now theirs. And so that's what God and Jesus, that's what they do in stories. So that's where we're starting. I don't know. Is it going to be like a question time? I kind of feel like I'm just rambling. I do have a plan, but if there's any questions, I don't know if you want to put them in chat. You can interrupt me.
Yeah, we can put questions in the chat, and then later we'll have everybody come on like we usually do. But I just love all of this, because what you're talking about isn't even necessarily only for speculative fiction and that broad genre. I mean, this is true for just any story that we're wanting to write, or that God has laid upon our hearts to write and to imagine and to create. And
That's
I also was really, I mean, I love the whole dragon and the St. George and that, but I had never heard anyone say that there was a difference between complex and complicated before. So I just wonder if you could unpack that maybe a teeny bit more than what you already did, because that really struck me as something interesting. Because yeah, I want my stories to be complex, I always thought I wanted them to be complicated. Now I'm not so sure I do. So it's like, oh my gosh, I want to
Yeah.
understand this a little bit better.
Yeah, good. So complicated means you've got 50 different characters.
Yeah. Too
That's
much.
complicated. But
Yeah.
complicated is you got 50 different characters, you got 800 different storylines, and you got all these, and it's hard to keep up with. Complex is there was a girl and she was a virgin,
Mhm.
and an angel showed up and said, "You're pregnant with God's baby." Like, oh my God. Right? That's complex. It's a very simple story. But see, complexity means there's layers to it.
Right.
Complexity means there's layers. The Bible is complex. In other words, Paul does this when in Galatians, where he talks about Ishmael and Isaac. He tells a story, and it's just the story. But then he says, but really, Isaac and Ishmael are the two covenants, the old and there's layers, there's complexity to truth. And stories, because stories have complexity, they can uniquely express the eternal because they have depth.
Yeah. Stories
uniquely express the eternal because they have depth. The creation story isn't a science book. The creation story is God spoke and he saw it and it was good. And then this happened and then this happened, right? All of that. So that's complexity. So complexity is themes and emotions, and it can be a simple story, but complexity is when you're infusing our stories with meaning and depth. All right. And that's what complexity is. And that's why you have to be careful with complication, because complication is distracting. The devil tries to complicate us. I'm just telling you, the devil tries to make it complicated because that discourages us. It makes us want to quit because we can't figure it all out. But God doesn't do that. He makes it deep. All right. Taking notes so fast. I'm sorry.
Notes too. I mean, this is great information.
All right. So we're going to go through, I love that, Brandy. I'm just seeing the first part of it. What she said, stories bypass the analytical part and get to the spiritual, right? That's where we're at. Now, that doesn't mean that our analytical parts are bad, right? I mean, God gave us that too, our emotions but what we long for in life is meaning. And it's not, that goes beyond logic and emotion. There's meaning and all that. So here, a little more theology. We have to believe miraculous things to be a Christian. We have to believe things that don't make sense and are supernatural to be a Christian. Everything from the creation story, we believe that creation is a supernatural event, and is a supernatural event. That's what we believe. We believe we were supernaturally created, right? Formed you in your mother's womb. You were fearfully and wonderfully made, right? I already talked about the virgin birth. We talk about the very fact that there was a being that was born who was both mortal and immortal at the same time. How do you do that? How do you be a person who is both man and God, who is both human and can be killed, and God who cannot be killed? You see what I'm saying? Like, we have to believe in magic to a degree. Like, we don't call it magic, but we have to believe in something supernaturally, and something supernatural beyond us that has entered our world. And so not to mention the death and then the resurrection, right? Man, I mean, there's so much, right? We could talk about so much in the Bible that's miraculous. And here's why we need that, because we live in a world that's, you want to use a science term, right? We have entropy. Everything is going away. Everything is dying. There's chaos, there's fear. And that's why I put all that in the long title. This is the world we live in, where everything we see that even if we build something amazing, let's say we take 20 years and we build something amazing, it can be destroyed like that. And if that's the world we live in, that's not a great world, right? But the gospel brings in stories that bring in another world. There's another world out there that's not like this one. And when it touches this world, miraculous things happen. You know, virgins have babies. God enters humanity. The dead rise again, right? The lame are healed. The poor have this is good news. That's why it's good news, is because we long for that. We long for a world where this temporary stuff doesn't break like it does. And that's what we do. So because of that, speculative fiction activates that sort of imagination in us. Speculative fiction expresses that sort of like, hey, there's something miraculous out there. Now, it could, in science fiction, it could be you can go faster than the speed of light, or right. I mean, like, we make up all sort of stuff in science fiction where you just kind of make it up, right? There's a laser sword. Well, how can a laser stop and only go so far, right? I mean, it's a lightsaber, right? But you kind of come up with these supernatural, even if it's technological, they're supernatural to us, right? That there's a ship that's flying out there, but it has gravity somehow, right? And the Star Trek Enterprise. And I mean, there's all this sort of stuff that's going on that even goes beyond what we understand of science. But what that does, just like the stories of miracles in the scripture, stories that kind of involve miracle and magic and like the supernatural, what they do is they give us hope. They give, oh, there's something else is possible. You see, here's where people get stuck, and here's where people get hopeless, is they think they only have option A and B. They only think they have option A and B. But what miracles teach us is there's an option C. There's a different way. There's something else out there. And that's what Chesterton is trying to say in his quote. He's saying, look, we know that dragons and evil exists. Like fairy tales, and by the way, originally fairy tales, if any of you have ever read the original fairy tales, they were extremely disturbing, right? So he's talking about extremely disturbing, like not the Disney version of fairy tales, but like the ones where people really did get eaten and alive, and it was sort of really crazy stuff, right? So he's saying that children already know this world exists. They live in this world. What they need to know is there's another world. There's a different world. And that's what Jesus said to pray, right? What do you pray? When you pray like this: Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done here. Like, bring heaven here. Help us to express heaven somehow. When we heal somebody, when we give hope, we're expressing that there's a different world. And so speculative fiction is unique in that sense, where it can activate the imagination. And that's why creativity gives people hope, because when you think there's only option A or B, and somebody says, no, there's another option, there's another way, that activates our imagination. It brings me hope. It brings people hope. Oh, wait, I don't have to live like that. I don't have to make these choices. It doesn't have to be this either or sort of idea. And people would do that with Jesus all the time, right? I mean, I'm just kind of bringing the Bible into this. I hope there's mostly Christians here. But people would do that to Jesus all the time. Who was this, who should we pay taxes or not? Right. And he's like, give me the money, right? I mean, he gives them another thing to look at. He gives them another option, right? And so we need our imagination and creativity stirred and activated for our dreams and for bigger possibilities, because I guarantee you, Abraham wasn't sitting in Ur thinking, man, one of these days I'm going to have like a billion kids. Like, he wasn't thinking that. Like, he was old, and he had never had a kid, and they'd given up. And yet, and then the story was interrupted with a miraculous possibility. And that's what we do with speculative fiction. We kind of interrupt stories with We interrupt people's lives and bring them into this reality of there's another world. And in science fiction, even though there's hard science fiction, which tries to be as scientific as possible and tries to kind of bring some of that in, but you're still creating new planets, right? You're still creating new, what would this alien look like? There's all this creativity within this stuff. And by the way, just as an aside, I meant to bring it in here. I've been reading this book called Believing is Seeing by Michael something Gillen. And this guy was a Harvard professor. He had a doctorate he had a triple doctorate in math, physics, and astronomy. And it's called, and he became a Christian. And he goes through how his learning of science to the extreme actually exposed the need for faith. That in actuality, atheism and science, what science is learning more and more, because science is learning, the more science knows, the more mystery there is, the more that they know that they can't prove. Like, how can you be immortal and mortal at the same time, right? That sort of stuff, like that shouldn't happen, but we know it does, right? And they're finding this stuff in science too, that, this is old, right? But light is a wave and a particle. It can't be that, but it is. And so they're finding more and more mysteries that they don't know how to explain. They don't know what it is, but they know it does exist. So basically his whole book is showing how much Christianity and what science is legitimately finding out have in common. I would just love to see like a real science fiction movie or story or something where it went over that, where the search for science actually led people to more faith, because that's actually in the Bible, right? It's Romans 1, that the first step of faith is to see that, creation and, somebody must have made this, there's something behind this. So God speaks through God also speaks through our imagination. All right. So the covenant with Abraham. So here's what happened with Abraham. Now you can believe it literally happened or it was just a vision, but Abraham sees God come down and, he splits the bull in half and God's coming down. Like, people saw visions in the Bible. I've seen visions, that might make some people uncomfortable, but I've had visions. It's not common, it's not every day, but I've had dreams, I've had visions. God speaks to us creatively. When he comes into the temple, with Isaiah and there's the different angels and all of that stuff, right? That's actually normal Christianity. Like, normal Christianity is that God speaks to you when you're asleep and he gives you dreams, and it's creative and there's symbols and there's all of this stuff, and speculative fiction can have that, right? It can have things they're very creative and imaginative, and yet they are symbols of something else, right? Sometimes we call that allegory. Sometimes, C.S. Lewis did that really well, right? Where he talked about, Aslan, or Aslan. There's a story, although just as an aside, C.S. Lewis did not consider what he was doing allegory, by the way. He considered it mythopoeia or something. I forget, that, but come on, it's kind of allegory. But all that to say is he had things in his books that were beautiful and creative, and yet spoke of a different reality, right? One of my favorites is the Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis, with when the boy, was it Eustace, right, became the dragon, and then when he reads the book, the scales fall off, and he's, and they get to the end of the world, and the mouse he's longing for this other world. There's just so much in it that's amazing. But that's just really, there's so much to that we can do in fantasy and science fiction, where not only are we activating people's mindset, but we're doing something that's actually very biblical. We're using creative things. How creative is Revelation? It can be really dark and disturbing, right? But but I mean, come on, there's all sorts of stuff that's going on. And John's like, man, God took me to this other place and showed me locusts and showed me this and showed me, and it's all very visual. And so all of that to say is, speculative fiction, when done in the kingdom mindset, can bring hope. It can activate people's imagination, can help them to dream of something else, something other than what they might feel stuck in. And when done right, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in story in modern, especially in the modern world, where the truths that they're trying to say aren't God's truth, right? But if we do it right, we can not only activate their imagination, but then teach those deep, even simple and complex truths that speak of another world, and really bring people hope, and tell them that, yes, we all know that there's evil in the world, but guess what? It can be beaten. Good wins in the end. And here's one way to kind of tell that story. So, all right, it's 11:33. I can be done. I said a lot. I'm sure I saw a lot of comments. There's like 57 in there. So I'm more than here. Maybe I should like click on this so I could see it.
Yeah, well, I just am really blown away. This is so inspiring. And I know this isn't our first episode of Writers Chat this year, but I wasn't here last week. So for me, it's the first one. And it just is like so inspiring just to hear these, just all this great stuff about imagination and creativity and hope. And I'm just really inspired to go write something, see what happens. Does anyone have any questions? I mean, we had a lot of comments. I don't know that we had questions necessarily in the chat. We talked about Revelation giving nightmares to and I said I had to quit reading a book of Grimm's fairy tales because I was getting nightmares. Yeah. Jill said she doesn't write speculative fiction, but wants to now. So you're inspiring people to take that on. Yeah.
I've always been a lover of spec fiction, fantasy, and sci-fi, and I found that it inspires me as a historical fiction writer. And there's just that element of world building, but it comes down to that deeper meaning, like you say. For me, it's always the redemption story that impacts me the most, and so that fills my stories. And I love that when it's used rightly in science fiction. Voyage of the Dawn Treader is my favorite too, and it is just packed with redemption.
Oh man,
speaking to the heart of the person and the characters. You start that story out hating Eustace, and then by the end you love him.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just good writing. I mean, that's really good writing. I've had somebody read something I wrote the other day, and they're like, I don't really like this character in the beginning, and I was watching this thing. It was actually on How to Write for Netflix, and the guy said, you don't have to write likable characters. You have to write interesting characters. In other words, you have to write characters that are engaging, because I think in Christian literature sometimes we think, well, I want people to like my characters, but they have to be redeemed from something, right? I mean, they have to be redeemed from something, and transformed, unless you're writing a tragedy and then they just decide not to be transformed, and that's it's tragic. But yeah, it's one of those things of, what's the redemption story? What's being redeemed in this story and transformed? What lies are being addressed with truth? Every story is about someone believing a lie and they are transformed by believing something different, a truth. And when they're not transformed by the truth, that's a tragedy. Those are literally the two types of stories. You've only got two types of stories. You've got what was the movie Stranger Than Fiction? You remember that movie where it's a great movie.
Seen it.
Huh?
I haven't seen it.
You haven't seen it? Well, basically Will Ferrell is just this normal dude, and he He's like, he works for the IRS or something. It's the best Will Ferrell movie because it's not really a Will Ferrell movie. But basically, he starts hearing the voice of an author in his head. Someone is narrating his life in his head, and that's the setup. And then so in order to try to figure it out, he kind of figures out it's an author, and they're writing his story, and so he goes to, I think it's Dustin Hoffman plays some literature professor, and the literature professor is like, well, what you got to figure out is if your story is a comedy or a tragedy. That's a long way to get there, but basically, so he's trying to figure out whether his whether his story is a comedy or tragedy. But the difference between a comedy and a tragedy is, do people believe the truth and are willing to be transformed by the truth? And that's every story. Now, what the lie is and what the truth is that's the complexity that you got to deal with, right? That's the complexity of your characters and complexity of the story and the themes. What lies are being addressed, but again, in speculative fiction, you're just doing it with unicorns and superheroes and it's fun, but again, it has that kind of added imaginative element to it where it's not real, like that's not real, but when God gave me a vision one day and I was in a field and there was a door, and I knew that wasn't real, but he was telling me something, like the message was real. He's just like Lazarus dying, and was it Lazarus? No, the poor man died, right?
Right.
And and then whoever the other guy dies and is in hell, and like I knew the story was made up, but it was telling something. It had a point, right? It had something to say. So anyway. Oh, and one other thing, speculative fiction, maybe not as much science fiction, but definitely fantasy was really, like if you look at C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Chesterton, it was started by Christians.
Yeah.
Like, by the way, also the scientific method was started by Christians.
Yeah.
Like these were Bible believing Christians who were like, we want to learn more about the world God has created. How do we do that in a systematic way? They came up with the scientific method. Now atheists think that that's the only way you can know anything. And it's like, well, that's just kind of really weird. But like definitely fantasy was started by these Christians who were trying to say something. And The Hobbit says something. The Hobbit has a theme. The Lord of the Rings has a theme. And when we understand the theme, it just brings so much depth into the story and all of that. So all right, I can be done.
No, I think I could just listen to you forever. It's just so fascinating, and creativity is just such a mystery, right? And it's like, to very simplistically praying for stories and then waking up the next morning and there's a story, it's like, oh, and it's like maybe not totally fleshed out, but you've got a direction. And I have found again and again when I've gotten stuck, like towards the end of a story, like maybe 3/4 of the way through, and it's like, oh my gosh, I wrote myself into a corner. The answer is already in the story. How did I know that?
Right.
How does that happen? But it happens again and again and again. But somehow our subconscious has already put there what we needed to finish out that story. But it can only come from God. I had that happen with a series. The answer in the 3rd book was in the 1st book. And it's like, how? It's so awe-inspiring to me. It's just like God does that. God does that. Right.
I love it. And I love the fact that we are meant to create with God. God wants us to co-create with him. Like literally, I love writing, but my writing changed a lot when I realized it's not like God tells me to write something and then I go write it. It's like, no, he's right there going, let's write together.
Yeah.
Let's you and me. That's what Adam and Eve did. that's what the perfect life was. God said they didn't go name the animals apart from walking with God, right? They were walking with God and they were naming them together. And they were doing that stuff. They were living together through purpose. And that was the intent. That was a design. And so, yeah, when we're writing our stories, man, we can really show a lot, and it helps us to draw closer to God. I don't know, I'm sure you have that experience too, right? You're like, oh, like we did this together, and that's what a good dad wants. He wants to do stuff together.
Absolutely.
I personally like writing speculative fiction because it helps me to think outside this world. I get dragged down a lot by this world, and I get bored with normal things. So I like to come up with something that's weird and wacky that sparks my interest, because it kind of takes a little bit to spark my interest. So when something's a little quirky or weird, or we have strange little people coming out from the crack in my desk, it's kind of neat. I like those things.
Yeah. Good.
I think the contrast of dark and light is what really, really gets me about fantasy fiction and those ones, and the necessity of it. I was reminded of something a pastor had told us a while back that it really sparked me in my imagination. I was reminded of it because he keyed it in with the creation stories you were talking about, and the question of why there's evil in the world versus why did God allow it. And he talked about the difference between light and dark, and he used a flashlight as an example. And he said, this is not a flashlight, it's a dark sucker. And you can't understand one without the other, because evil is the absence of God, the dark is the absence of light. And so I loved that contrast, and I see it so sharply in spec fiction and fantasy and sci-fi and stuff. I think those are some of the genres that are, it seems they're freer to explore that somehow. Yeah.
And there's this whole, and it's happening in all sorts of genres, right? There are more and more stories where there's no moral. Like there's more and more stories where there's no, you're not saying anything about truth. You're not saying anything about life. It's like just everything stinks, right? That's, in fantasy that's called grimdark, right? It's a whole part of fantasy fiction where people are writing stories where none of the characters are good. They're all just out for themselves. And I mean, like, it's just this, it's the Game of Thrones sort of thing, right? I mean, the Game of Thrones sort of kind of kicked some of that off. And it's a fascinating YouTube. I can't remember. I think it was on NPR originally. But anyway, there's a fascinating YouTube out there where this literature professor goes into why no one will ever be satisfied with Game of Thrones. He said everybody wants him to finish Game of Thrones, but when he finishes Game of Thrones, no one will like it. He said, because Game of Thrones acts like a tragedy, but the point of a tragedy is to still show a moral. The point of a tragedy is because in both a comedy and a tragedy, truth wins. Truth always wins. And that's why it's important to kind of look at it in that sense. But he's saying Game of Thrones is set up, the truth isn't going to win. So no one's going to like this because you're not really saying anything. And so for all of that's why it's so important to put the dark and the light in there. How do we overcome? How do we fight? And here's the other thing. This isn't unique to speculative fiction, but in a great story, that's why your characters, like, it's not a great story if your character believes a lie and someone says, well, this is the truth, and they go, oh, well, great, I'll believe that, and everything's good. Like, they have to struggle, because I struggle with truth. Right? It corrects me. It doesn't, I'm like, well, I was going this way. And truth says, no, go this way. Right? I'm like, well, I don't want to go that way. Right. And that's what, even people who aren't Christians write stories that do this. And they know it's satisfying but they know that it is satisfying, but they don't always know why. And I'm saying we know why. We know that stories have a purpose, that God it's not just a random willy-nilly, that's my wife's word, willy-nilly. It's not random willy-nilly, like, well, let's just write a story and maybe somebody's going to be entertained. The kind of stories that stick with us, even if we don't know why, the stories that stick with us are stories that tell something about truth. And again, use those imaginative elements, if it's fantasy and science fiction, to, again, speak of a different world. And that's what's so great about science fiction. You're going to another planet, or you're going, right? Like you're exploring something, and that there's something else out there. And that's what, to me, what makes speculative fiction unique. But you do it, and you can do it in a romance too, right? That there's more to life out there than what we see. I mean, you can do it in any sort of story, but speculative fiction just does it in that sort of imaginative way that we literally have examples for in the scripture, of very imaginative visions and dreams and all of that stuff, where God communicates to people through this. And so, yeah.
All right. Well, this has all been wonderful. Let's spend just a couple of minutes. Can you talk a little bit about marketing, or I don't even know marketing, but like submitting to publishers, like who's out there, the market for these genres, just anything more practical, I guess. I have loved all this talk. Believe me, it's been so inspiring just to kind of dig down into some practicalities as far as getting your work published.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really hard to get published.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Only in, I think, the Christian genre. If you are writing for, outside the Christian market, there is a plethora of markets, especially short fiction.
Yeah, and it's just because there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of people who want to do this, who want to write fiction in general and speculative fiction, and we can just thank Peter Jackson for that. I mean, like people started reading fantasy fiction like it was just flying off the shelves, and they were signing everybody for a couple of years, and then but now they have there's that sort of died down, right? There was that sort of bubble. Oh, and also, right, J.K. Rowling, and I mean, like, so there's some stuff that kind of happened there over 5 or 10 years that really just exposed just how great speculative fiction can be. And there's some great writers out there, right? So Norma says her baby showed up. All right, bye, Norma. And so here's what I would do, and I'm still trying to do. So first of all, if you're going to get published, you need what's called a high concept idea. In other words, you need something that hasn't been done before. You need a fantasy, if it's in fiction in general or anything, you need an idea that hasn't been done, and then execute it well, right? And so those are the two practical things. And I know that's still very creative and sort of, out there, but because the fantasy genre has become, and superheroes, and that's my dog, and science fiction, because that stuff has become so saturated, that you need what we call a high concept idea. Hold on, I'm going to close that door. But you just need a high concept idea. So you can't do another Star Trek. You can't do another Star Wars. You can't do another Harry Potter. I mean, like, because what happens a lot of times is people fall in love with a certain type of story, and then they just write one like it. And what you really have to do is kind of do a little spin on it, and or do a mashup of something that hasn't been done before, whatever it might be. Now my dog is sitting here protecting me, but all that to say is So that's the first thing. And then secondly, still have the high concept, because the high concept is going to get attention. Oh, I've never seen anything like that before. Tell me more. And then next you're going to have to put characters and story in it that have complexity and depth. So that's the execution part. And then I would also build up email lists. I would, do things like, have a short story or a novella or something in the world that you create that's also sort of high concept that you give away and get email addresses for. There's a lot of different ways to do that. I'd use Book Funnel and Story Origin are the two that I use. There's a huge fantasy science fiction part of that. Those work really well there to get email addresses, and just stay educated about what's going on. Watch shows, read books, right? What's going on in what's going on in entertainment, what's going on in the industry. I don't know if it's really technically fantasy, but one of my favorites shows recently has been the Mysterious Benedict Society. Is that what it's called? It's on Disney Plus.
I think I've seen the image for that, but I don't know for sure what it's called, but I wanted to see that too, but I don't know that much about it.
Yes, the Mysterious Benedict Society.
Wow.
I watched it. I watched the first episode and I had to watch the last 5 minutes 3 times because it was the gospel. It was the gospel. It was the gospel. And it was so amazing. And then of course, we got into the series, my family and we got into the series, and it's like a middle grade sort of story. And then the more we learned about it, the more we learned, no, the author is a Christian. Like there's a series of books. And I'm like, because I was just shocked Disney had it on their show. Like, I'm like, that's the gospel. Like, he's not saying Jesus and he's not, but like, that's the gospel. And so that's the kind of stuff that I think connects with people, and that we have a unique perspective on truth and how good truth can be, and how redemptive truth is. And you just know what's going on out there. And I don't know if I answered your question, but the email addresses are huge. You're not going to get better than email addresses. On social media, just be a fan of people and stuff. And when movies come out, say, oh, I love Spider-Man or whatever the thing is that you love, just connect with people over that. Those are kind of the main things, I think.
Something I have found very helpful is joining a couple of science fiction fantasy groups on Facebook, and just listening to people as they post and then respond to posts, the kinds of things they say. You get some pretty interesting stuff in there, and you get to really hear from readers the kinds of things that they like, that they don't like, and things that really bug them, and things they want to see more of. It's a great thing.
Yeah. And those groups are great. And I do the same thing. Like sometimes if I'm looking for something to read, I'll go into the group and I'll say, what's something that's been, because part of being a good author is knowing what's going on in the industry, right? And what's really connecting. And so you say, what's a book that's come out in the last year that everybody loves, and you might get 10 different suggestions, and then I just go, okay, well, which ones do my library have? and then I go from there, right? And then I just pick one that looks interesting. And but no, I agree, those Facebook groups can be really valuable.
So Britt, I have a question for you. For the people that might not think naturally in a speculative fiction kind of way when it comes to the writing, what are some ways that people can start to turn on their spec-fic brain to start to see those kinds of writing ideas?
That's a good question.
So it's like, for instance, when you said your dog was barking and you said, I'm gonna get up and shut the door. And then you moved and you touched your headphone and then you didn't go shut the door. I'm like, hey, look at that. He's got this really fancy headset that allows him to remotely shut the door just by touching it. So, you
Right.
know, and that prompts me to think, well, you know, that's a spec fic brain when you see something in the world and your brain twists it into a spec fic way. So do you have any tips for like nurturing that for somebody that maybe doesn't naturally do that or wants to learn how to do it more?
I think, okay, so leading up to it, Stephen King, if you've never read On Writing, Stephen King, even if you don't like Stephen King stuff, although his fantasy with the Dark Tower stuff is some of my favorite, but Stephen King in his book On Writing, which is for every writer, any writer should read it. He says, Louis L'Amour and I, if you don't know who Louis L'Amour is, he was a very famous Western author. I read a lot of his books too. And he said, Louis L'Amour and I can go and see the same lake next to a town. He said, Louis L'Amour will imagine a herd of cows coming to that lake, and the lone, you know, cattle hand that's driving the cattle and go all through his, you know, that's what Louis L'Amour will imagine when he sees the lake. He says, I will see a monster coming up out of that lake and going into the town and start eating the citizens, or right. He said, we see the same lake, but the stories we come up with are different. And so part of that is just sort of natural. Part of it is reading a lot in the genre. Like part of it is reading and watching a lot in the genre, knowing what's out there. And then something else to do, especially if you know anything about story, is start asking yourself, how I like this. Now, how could it be different? So like, how could, like, okay, we know superheroes are cool. Well, what would be a different twist on superheroes? You know, and one of the books that I'm shopping around and publishers are very interested in, we'll see what happens. It's called Superhero Grandpa. And it's about Emma Kim, and she's a middle school girl, and she loves superheroes, and she reads comic books, and she lives with her mom, and her dad has passed away, and her estranged grandpa is sick and comes to live with them because he's recovering from the hospital, and nobody wants him there. He doesn't want to be there. And then they realize one day that he's developing superpowers. And then so she decides to, since she's the expert, she's going to teach him what it means to be a superhero. And so it's a superhero story, but it's not a superhero story. It's really it's a reconciliation story. It's really about purpose. It's really, see what I mean about complexity? So it's got superhero stuff in it, and it's funny and it's cute, and it'll have that, but it's also has those deeper levels of, and that's what I mean about, you got to come up with something that's a little different, know what's out there, come up with something a little different. And then start asking questions like, how could I make this different? Or how can I do something different that has never been done before? Or at least that I've seen. I mean, it might be out there, right? And it's getting really bright behind me. I'm very sorry. I'm starting to.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, if everybody wants to come back on, we've got just a couple minutes. Melissa, do you want to talk about next week?
Next week, Susan Neal's going to come on and talk about the writer's health. So that's what's going on.
I like Susan.
Yeah, she's great. We've had her on one time before, so it'll be fun to have her back too.
Yeah.
So that'll be good to, also as we're doing New Year's resolutions and before we start breaking them, to have someone come on and talk about being a healthy writer, because we all sit too much, right? We all do. We all sit way too much. Sophia, you mentioned Havoc in the comments in the chat, and I wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to do a plug, since we're talking about spec fic today.
Okay. If you're interested in learning more about different forms of spec fic, read the Havoc online. I put the link in there. They have new stories every single day, and they're in 5 speculative fiction categories. Mysteries, science fiction, just wackiness, that's Wacky Wednesday, thrillers, and fantasy. The great thing about reading Havoc is it's 1,000 words. That's a quick read. And you get to read a lot of different takes. The second thing is, if you write for Havoc, your story will always get feedback, whether or not it's accepted. And that was really helpful for me to learn to hone my skills, to sharpen the stories. It's been a very profitable experience, not financially, but professionally, to both read, then write, and now edit with Havoc. It's a nurturing environment. So I would encourage it. Lots of people with crazy ideas that I love. Flash fiction is a great way to learn to write tight. You're right, Sally.
Mm-hmm.
And we're taking submissions all the time. So go to the Havoc site I posted, and then look at the little Write for Us tab and follow those instructions, please. And it also teaches you a thing about learning how to submit a story.
For those of you who aren't seeing the chat, it's Havoc is HAVOK, not C, just a.
And it's gohavok.com. So you have to have that GOHAVOK.com.
And not only Sophia, but the people that I know with Havoc are just amazing people. They are so sweet and so amazing and encouraging. And, so yeah, definitely good people to get involved with.
All right, Britt, thank you again so much for being here. This was just, I am just totally blown away and just have so much to think about, and I love that. So thank you for sharing so much of your heart with us and your knowledge, and not just about spec fic. I feel like so much of this is just, no matter what we write, this is so beneficial and inspiring. What are you up to right now? What are you working on? You were talking about the one story. Anything else or anything you want to plug?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of publishers are looking at Superhero Grandpa. I've got a couple nonfiction books that I'm really excited about. And one I just signed a because C.S. Lewis is my hero. I have to do both. I can't just do spec fic. I have to do spec fic and then also write. But I have a couple nonfiction. I just signed one contract with Bold Vision and Rhonda Ray. Very excited about that one. That was kind of a nice surprise. And I've got another book on missions that another publisher's interested in. And as far as I'm trying to decide what to write next, based on some of, I've got a couple ideas. One of my ideas is I want to write the story of David as a gritty fantasy novel. As a trilogy. I want to write the story of David that would be rated R.
Yeah, some parts of it are. That's no question.
Not get super graphic, but it's definitely not a nice, clean Christian story. And because I think one of the things that I've done that God showed me with this book is I was like, I don't want to be too gritty and then turn off Christians, and I don't want to be too redemptive and turn off non-Christians. And God was like, just do it all, just do it. So that's going, but I also have some other ideas of a science fiction idea and another idea, like a dystopian idea. So I'm just trying to figure out what I want to do next, where I want to focus next. Trying to develop those high concept ideas, something that hasn't been done before, but would really be fun. So that's where I am.
Yeah. I know I've got so many ideas. I'll never be able to write all the
right.
that I want to write. I keep a list, but it's like, it's not going to happen. But anyway, it's fun. It's just fun to imagine different things. So everybody, thank you for being here. If you joined us, if you're watching the replay, know that we are here every Tuesday morning, 11 o'clock Eastern, 10 o'clock Central. Join our Facebook Writers Chat group. Check out our Writers Chat page on Facebook. Am I missing anything? And thanks again to Britt, and thanks to all of you who are here, and we'll see you next week on Writers Chat. Bye-bye.